Welcome. We are so thrilled to be with you today to talk about a subject that is near and dear to our hearts, and that is the idea of the independent press and the importance of it and the cultivation of it that we have here at Ohio State through the work that we do with Lantern Media. And we have an incredible panel that's here with you that's going to share their insights, but we want to hear from you. So we received some questions beforehand, and we're certainly going to ask those, but we want you to know that the question and answer box at the bottom is for you. We want your questions to come early. We want them to come often, and we're going to try to answer them all. I'm really excited to introduce you to the panelists here today. I'm going to start off with our distinguished alum, Jay Smith, who is here. He began his newspaper career at 17 with an internship at the Cincinnati Post and Times Star. He retired as 2008 as the president of Cox Newspapers, which at the time included 17 daily newspapers, including the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and the Dayton Daily News. He also served as publisher of the Austin American-Statesman. He is a proud graduate, but I think he might say that his greatest accomplishment at the Lantern was meeting his wife, with whom he has 4 children. They've been married for 48 years. Congratulations, Jay. I'd also like to introduce you to Mike Slater, who is Social and Behavioral Sciences Distinguished Professor and Director of the School of Communication. In 2019, Mike received the Career Achievement Award from the International Communication Association for his research contributions related to media and polarization, health communication, and the persuasive influence of narratives. And it's a busy time at the School of Com. We're just thrilled that Mike could be here with us. I'd also like to introduce you to Jack Long, who is a third-year journalism major and the managing editor for digital content at the Lantern. He's also experienced working in public radio. He worked at WOSU on the Snollygaster podcast. And after he graduates, he hopes to work at a public media station working as a producer or a reporter. Welcome, Jack. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce you to my good friend Spencer Hunt, who is faculty advisor for the Lantern and a journalism lecturer here at Ohio State. Before teaching, Spencer spent more than 20 years as a newspaper reporter, including at the Cincinnati Enquirer and the Columbus Dispatch. Welcome, gentlemen. Well, I'm going to put you on the spot first, Jay. And I think that if we're going to talk about independent news, we first need to understand what that means. And you've had such a breadth of experience, you know, from collegiate media moving up through the highest levels of journalism. So what do we mean when we talk about an independent press and its significance to us as a democracy?
Nicole, I think a strong and independent media organization is one that can hold a mirror up to its community without fear that in any way that mirror will shatter when the community doesn't like what it sees. To do that, that media organization has to have a strong soapbox on which to stand. Right now, the Lantern soapbox is a bit wobbly. Print advertising revenue has fallen, as it has for most traditional media groups. And the Lantern has largely converted, and I would say it's made this conversion quite well, but it's converted to an online model. And digital ad revenue yields pennies for each dollar that print revenue yields. So right up front, I'll make the pitch. The Lantern needs our support. It needs our support as readers. It needs our support as donors to ensure that it's strong and it's independent. And by the way, I would also like to say that I think the Lantern is doing some of its best work ever. And that includes the period 50 years ago when I was its editor. You know, from the ongoing coverage right now of the COVID-19 virus and its impact on the campus to a wonderfully solidly reported piece of groundbreaking journalism that looked at sexual harassment and how Ohio State responds. That is very professional work that these so-called student journalists are doing. You know, I really use the phrase student journalists somewhat mockingly. To me, these kids are first rate and they are journalists, period.
Well, we couldn't agree more. Mike, I was hoping you could maybe talk us through a little bit, and Jay has certainly outlined some of the challenges that we're facing. But as the director, your commitment to not just keeping the Lantern afloat, but moving it forward has just really been, it's inspirational, I think, to those of us who work here. What is your philosophy behind the importance of the Lantern to not just our journalism program, but to Ohio State as a whole? You're muted. We've all done that.
If the last 4 or 5 years have taught us anything, it's just how essential quality journalism is in this era of misinformation, of so-called news, just flipped around through social media algorithms. The institution of journalism has never, I think, meant so much while being under such threat. And it really is, so important that we have a place where people are being trained in this key craft, art, calling, I would say. It's absolutely crucial to a functioning democracy. We've never seen that so clearly. And it's something where we have to keep passing the torch. And to do that, we have to have a quality, independent outlet like the Lantern. The other piece, the other perspective I have is narrower, but as director of the school, I'm responsible for pedagogy and for helping train young people to be able to succeed in a very competitive and world that's changing extraordinarily quickly. This is a place where people are running a 24/7 online news operation, handling extraordinarily sensitive and difficult stories. They may be young, but as Jay said, they're professionals. And to see people at this stage of their life being professionals, you don't have that chance very often in this world as somebody in college. It's quite extraordinary, and the way people rise to that as a Lantern, I find inspiring. And just on the brass tacks level, people who do this, as Jay alluded, and for those people who are listening who have not visited thelantern.com, the whole paper's there. It's updated constantly. It's terrific. They're doing some state-of-the-art multimedia work. Lantern TV is feeding into thelantern.com, so some of the stories will have essentially audiovisual news features, as well as the band when the football seasons, if that ever happens. But it's a very dynamic and very creative, very kind of state-of-the-art kind of news outlet they've created. And it's not only exciting as media, it's just, it's an extraordinary opportunity for all involved. So I'm very proud and very excited to be part of it.
That's wonderful. Well, we got a great question in, Jack, that I think is right up your alley, that sometimes student journalists aren't taken as seriously as and I'm putting in quotes, reputable outlets that are more well-known. And this is from Jessica Langer. And she's asking what aspiring journalists can do to be taken more seriously. And I, having the privilege of working with you guys, you are in some very serious situations where, we don't have the luxury of being students. So how do you face that kind of, bias against your reporting, and how do you confront it if you do?
Yeah, I think it kind of works actually for us. Sometimes people don't take us serious, so they'll talk to us, and we can write this, better, more digging story, because they think it's just going to be some type of small little publication. But really, and the Lantern has done a great job, especially with everything that's happened this summer and extending back into the spring semester. The stories that we're doing, they're credible and they're important to our audience. And when you're doing that type of work, people don't really care, right? People don't care that it's a college newspaper. During the protests that were happening in Columbus, we had traffic. We had people following us on Twitter and on our social media channels that had no connection with Ohio State, that weren't even in Ohio. But we did the reporting and we showed up and we were a valuable community member. And so there is that challenge that people don't always take us serious. And, the stories that we do, our daily stories aren't, these big features of what's happening in Washington or corruption. A lot of times it's just covering and documenting what's happening on campus. And there's value to that for years to come for people to kind of look back at that. So it kind of hurts and helps us at the same time.
I totally hear you. And Spencer, I'd love your perspective on this because, we were just talking actually before we came on air like this, and we were talking about, what it would mean if we were a corporate entity. And I think in some ways, student journalism is like almost one of the last venues of true independent journalism. If you think about the kind of, purity of pursuit that we have in teaching students to be journalists, they have maybe freedom that they wouldn't have if we were in a more corporate structure. How would you look at
it? I would agree with a lot of what Jack is saying. And I think people recognize the value of a well-told, well-reported story. And those kinds of things speak for themselves. We do live in an era where people will gravitate towards news that they agree with, and there's plenty of opportunities to do that, whether you're a fan of MSNBC or Fox News or any other kinds of advocacy journalism. To be independent means that you walk the line between all of those kinds of things, right? And that you're willing to tell stories that don't necessarily reflect a certain agenda, right? And so when we're able to tell these stories, then people can see that we are being independent. And so I think corporate journalism, fake news, a lot of those kinds of things are labels that are applied to things where people feel that they're being steered toward a certain conclusion. And what we're trying to do, and what we've always been trying to do here, is present the facts and let people make up their own mind. That sometimes is harder to do than you think. But I've been very, very happy with what I've seen, and I've been here 5 years. Very happy with what I've seen from students who come in. And I think one of the things that helps, to get more towards your question, is when students come in, they're not as maybe predisposed or cynical, right? And so when these things happen, they're happening for the first time. And I think that brings a certain amount of fresh perspective to the news that sometimes is lacking.
Absolutely. Well, maybe I want you to continue, if you could. Just Zachary Sparks had a great question here about how do we better achieve balance between the freedom of an independent press and the regulation that we need to minimize the impact of fake news and this anti-scientific rhetoric in this really tense and highly partisan political atmosphere that we're in.
There's all sorts of filters that would be applied to stories, especially if they're coming out on Facebook or Twitter, that you have to be aware of. But I strongly feel that if we're doing the things that I just laid out and we're doing them correctly, we're not going to run into any of those kinds of problems. And so for me, the approach is fairly simple. I've yet to see one of our stories run afoul of a filter that would say this is biased or made up in some way. I do think, though, that is a very real concern. But if you're sticking to the fundamental tenets of journalism, which is what we're talking about here, then we're really not going to run into that. Now, people will be upset with you, maybe, because what you're writing doesn't really reflect what they want to hear, but that's an altogether better problem to have than the other way around.
Can I jump in here real quick? I think the idea that, how do we regulate journalism to prevent fake news? That entire term fake news was first used to coin news that the person who was using that term disagrees with. It wasn't an attack on the accuracy or the fairness or the facts that were in it. It was purely a value judgment that I didn't like this, and I got that term. And you look, I think this question about how do you manage fake news or like anti-scientific rhetoric I saw, there's this trust that happens with journalism where the majority of journalists who call themselves journalists and have a passion for actually uncovering the truth and documenting the community, they're not there to mislead. Like, despite what you might hear, and yes, problems do happen and mistakes happen, which that's a whole nother issue, but there's no intent to it, right? There's no one who sets out and goes, I'm going to do this. And those channels that do that push kind of this false narrative, or, their entire job, their entire purpose is not to report the truth. It's to persuade you. And I think now more than ever, it's opinions that are being labeled news when really the facts that they're basing their opinions off of aren't even true. They're not even correct. And so we're starting with a complete different set of facts. You're not going to see that at the Dispatch or WOSU or the Lantern. We're not going to start off with a completely different belief of facts. We're going to start off with what we saw, what's been reported, and the numbers behind a story, rather than saying we need to push this narrative. So
I totally hear you. Well, we have a great, Timothy Powell's asking us, I'm going to ask you to start, Mike. Where do you get your news, and how do you kind of steer clear of sensationalization and even what Jack just described, which sounded a lot like propaganda, which I think we're surrounded by, even though we may not even know it.
I spent a long time in New York City, so I use the NewYorkTimes.com for my kind of daily read. And I'm a researcher, so if something comes up that I have questions about, I multi-source it. I just do some Google searching. For an academic and a journalist, you're pretty good at sorting out sources. Although actually, my son kind of schooled me in this. He went to school at OSU, and for the Middle East, the way he does it, he gets onto the Al Haaretz and Al Jazeera sites, reads their two wildly differing versions of, and figures reality is somewhere smack in between.
I think a lot of us could say that. Jay, where do you get your news from?
I am partial to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which is my hometown newspaper here in Atlanta. But the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NPR. Having said that, I also try to pay a fair bit of attention to social media to find out what else is going on. I've got a pretty good, I hope, a pretty good BS detector, and can sort out what is and isn't correct. I'm not a favorite with some of my geezer buddies who are prone to pass along unchecked, unverified things all the time, because I will go to Snopes.com or to another fact-checking site and be the bad guy who says, wait a minute, this just ain't so. And I've learned not to send those replies back to everybody, but I do send it back to the party who sent it to me. You just need to be careful. You need to understand that there are reliable sources of news, and unfortunately, there are a lot of really bad actors out there, and you need to figure out who they are and pay attention to them, but don't buy into their BS.
I think,
Sorry.
I think one of the question is not so much of like, what news source do you go to? Because you're going to live different places. It's media literacy. It's being able to think critically about every single piece of information that you receive. One of my favorite pastimes is when my uncle says something that's questionable, I'll just go, well, where'd you hear that? Well, it might be Facebook. Okay, well then, was there a link? What was the reporting around it? What evidence was around it? You can trust a news source and they've done great reporting, but there could be one day where they make a mistake. And that doesn't mean that you just go willingly believing that. You still have to think critically, and it's really important to have an independent press, but also have the readership and the audience that can think critically and actually make judgments about what they're reading?
Well, readership is such a huge question, right? And it's so competitive. You know, Sandy Hermanoff has just a great question here about competing with so many private publishers. You know, how do you know, and maybe Spencer, you can start with us here. How do you know who's telling the truth? How do you know, it seems like we could spend our entire lives just fact checking the things that we discover that we think may be news on social media. How do you balance all this incoming information? And then just to loop into that, Greg has a question here about, not really carrying the false narrative through, and especially now when we're faced with a pretty consistent stream of false narrative coming from high-ranking officials. How do you avoid getting caught up in what can be a tidal wave of less clean things than water?
There's a certain checklist that I'll go through when I'm reading a story, and it gets to media literacy in some ways. But when I'm looking at a story, I'm assessing where the information is coming from. And so a key thing for me is, where are we getting our facts from? And if a story is attributing all of its facts to another website, but there's no link to it, that's a little suspicious. If the story is presenting sources that the reporter interviewed, then that comes across. And then I'm looking for balance. If there's an opposing viewpoint, is that presented within the story too? There are certain things that you can kind of, once you start getting into a story, you can kind of just see whether or not you're being asked to consider or told what to think. And so it sometimes will take about 3 or maybe 4 or 5 paragraphs if you're reading something, or maybe a couple minutes if you're listening or watching. But you can kind of suss this out pretty clearly. And I think when people are reading something where it is well reported, it's balanced, and we're presenting all of these things in the right way, they will value that a lot more, but not necessarily think about why. And so it comes from, I think, reading a lot or listening a lot or watching a lot, and then you're able to apply a filter and say, okay, this is baloney, or this is really valuable to me.
Well, I wanted to have 2 quick call outs here because I don't want to miss them. Jack, Sandy is really just sending out compliments on your Wexner story, so she was very impressed with that. And Marilyn is suggesting that we read The Atlantic because it's great for reporting. It would be a terrific source. And Marilyn, we do actually, I signed quite a few articles from The Atlantic, and it's funny, things start to converge in people's minds, and they're not really sure what is a long-term trusted piece of new, a news source, and what's not. And that's one of the things that I think that we balance the most. And Mike, this is something I know is such a huge part of the school as a whole, and certainly our journalism program. But Faith's asking about, how do we build this critical thinking mindset in our students? It seems like a lot of people who are no longer students lack it, but we want to make sure that people leave our program, as best equipped as possible to be thinking critically. How do we do that?
Well, I think for students who are our majors, it's so built into so much of what we teach, I'm less concerned, but most people are not communication majors. One thing we're actually doing right now is we are developing an online course called Media and Citizenship, which we are expecting to become eligible in the new general education requirements. And it's basically a media literacy course. It both looks at how misinformation is spread, how it's disguised, how to recognize it. And perhaps the most important part of media literacy is learning to recognize your own systematic ways of being biased. Unfortunately, we human beings have a tendency to want to believe that which is consistent with what they want to believe. That is jokingly considered the first fact check of all. Does it support what I want to believe about the world? And that, unfortunately, is a lot of people's default. So recognizing that, learning to recognize that tendency is actually an important part of media literacy. Other things, actually, when some of our faculty are leading researchers in this there's misinformation, and there are things that are worth knowing. For example, people are actually not unsophisticated about realizing you can't believe everything you read on the internet, right? You know, there's a lot of garbage out there. However, what's really seductive is when your friend Joe, you think's a really good guy, sends you something that he got on the internet. He may not even believe it, he just thought it was funny or cool. You believe it because you believe Joe. In other words, the sourcing breaks down on the internet and social media. You're getting things from people you care about, that you want to like, you want them to like you. Sharing their feelings about something is a way to be close to them and be part of the group. And so there's a lot of forces in the way social media is set up that lead people away from thinking critically and lead more towards a groupthink that just sort of feels good quickly. And that is actually a danger that we don't really know how to address. And that, I think, harking back to other question, is that does create a serious question in terms of policies, is if algorithms that companies like Facebook use are designed to maximize that, it's fundamentally destructive to discourse in a democracy. And what can be done? What are they willing to do? These are difficult questions. There are people at those companies who are asking those questions, and with a lot of frustration. It's a very hard problem.
Absolutely. Well, I want to shift us into something that's just near and dear to my heart. I want to talk about the lantern itself. So we're getting some great questions coming on here, and Spencer, maybe you can answer some of them, and certainly Jack. Specifically, several people would like to know about some analytics on the lantern. How many people are reading it digitally? What topics are they most interested in? Can you help us understand the current audience of the lantern and kind of the pathway that the editorial direction has taken?
Well, we both look at the analytics. Jack is managing editor for digital content, and I think he has a lot of good insights. I would just say, generally speaking, we break our audience down into at least 4 specific groups. Students, of course, we got 61,000 here. And so the Lantern is the independent student voice of Ohio State. And we would say faculty and staff and administration, and then alumni, 500,000, I believe, alums. And so we're read all over the country. It's not just in Columbus. It used to be that the paper was printed and just distributed here, and that's the only way you could get it. People are reading us all over the world now, which is awesome. And then parents, right? And increasingly parents have been tuning in to see what we've been writing about, what the latest news is about the pandemic and the virus and testing and quarantining and everything like that. On a given day, we'll have thousands of people looking at our news online, and that's primarily where we operate. And ever since this summer, when we've switched to an even more, even greater focus for online distribution, we've seen our readership increase about 73% over the previous year. That's going back to May. And of course, there's been a lot of news this year. There's been it started with the protests downtown. And then, are we going to be, how is it going to reopen? Just the announcement of football coming back today was a really big deal. Jack, what other things would you like to add?
Yeah, just generally, we receive about a couple 100,000 page views a month, which is pretty good for the newspaper of our size and the amount of reporting that we do. We're not, we don't put out 500 stories a day. We put out a select handful, less than 10 every day. So it's a pretty good numbers for us. We also this past year have done a lot better on social media and having people more aware of us. As a digital enterprise, I used to joke that the Lantern was a newspaper with a website. But now truly just because of how our hand has been forced, we really do have to kind of focus on our digital products, which have made us more competitive too with the Dispatch and WOSU and BC4 and all those channels as well. One interesting thing that Spencer actually pointed out, was it yesterday or the day before, is that our demographics, the age demographics of students, 18 to 24-year-olds, has actually been increasing and has about doubled this year than previous years, which is great because, you know, we're at a university. And so hopefully we would have people who are reading, who are students. But yeah, there's not much else I want to add about that. But we have been growing. And compared to last year's, because of our emphasis on a digital product first, that's led to most of our growth. One thing is we're also reporting on what people want to read about. You know, Jay has made a comment before where, and I might butcher this, that, you know, he wasn't in the business of, you know, reporting the news, he was of building an audience. And one way that we look at building that audience is having truthful, very fair, very accurate reporting that's meaningful for people, and they just keep coming back. So that's how we kind of look at it.
Just one thing I wanted to add is that when you do produce news that people value, then you do grow your audience. And we've seen that response through the separate channels that we reach out on socially with Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We've made significant gains there. And when you're talking about independent news, right? So one of the stories that we had right off the bat was how the university was cracking down on and suspending students for partying. And we had a story that analyzed how a lot of the suspensions that were handed out went to students that didn't have those parties. And so that was a very big read among our student demographic.
No question. I remember something that stuck with me, Spencer, especially we met with the Columbus Dispatch, and I remember they and others like WOSU have told us that the Lantern is one of the first places they go in the morning to see news. And I mean, that's, I think, a real testament to the contribution that the Lantern makes to the community as a whole. So Jay, you know, we're so lucky that you are so engaged with our students now. The mentorship program that we have, I know I was just talking to Sam Robbins the other day about, you know, our editor-in-chief, about how influential it has been to be able to work with you. And so maybe you can take us through a little bit of how the Lantern experience maybe changed over time, you know, from the time that you've been involved with the Lantern to now. What are some of the biggest changes that you've seen, and kind of the significance of those changes?
Well, I think, Nicole, the biggest change is clearly the medium itself. It's gone from exclusively ink on paper to occasionally ink on paper, but mostly digital. Fundamentally, I don't think that things have changed. I think if anything, I look back on my college years, and I jokingly asked Jack, how much time are you spending in class versus at the Lantern? And he didn't give me a straight up answer, which indicates to me he's probably spending a lot more time at the Lantern. But I think Lantern staffers a long time ago and Lantern staffers today, this is their education. You know, what they're learning in the classroom is fine, but what they are learning right now in real time, dealing with real stories, dealing with often university officials who want absolutely nothing to do with them. You know, I've worked with the current editor, last year's editor, and the year before that, a young man who had the audacity to want to ask, you know, how much money is Ohio State spending with outside legal counsel? And Ohio State, of course, has a lot of big issues ranging from Urban Meyer to Dr. Krause to a fired band director. And it's not eager to see those things get to the light of day. So this young man, a Lantern staffer, began to poke, and clearly he was getting stiff-armed by the university. They did not want to disclose where the university was spending what turned out to be millions upon millions of dollars annually. And our young guy went to the state controller's office, got the information, And at that point, he had it. And suddenly the university began to open up and to talk. That's the kind of story that we used to love to do at the Lantern of old, and it's the kind of story that they love to do right now. I mentioned that Title IX story a moment ago, and it's indicative of what they're doing. These kids, I got a text from a fellow Lantern staffer, who's one of my dearest friends, a guy named Lou Heldman, as we were talking. And he said, if you want to be taken seriously, be well prepared. Well, because I suspect Lou is watching this webinar right now, I want to tell Lou, and I want to tell anybody else, these kids are damn well prepared. And they're well prepared, Nicole, because I know you and Spencer and Mike demand that of them. And I've talked way too long. I'll shut up.
Not at all. So Ronnie has a really good point, and Jack, maybe you can talk about this because you are the managing editor for content, right? Or is that
digital? But yeah.
digital content. So Ronnie is saying he wants to address the issue of content versus reporting the news. And he mentions that when he worked as a journalist, that they covered the story, and now the terminology is content. And is there a chance of returning to this idea of reporting the news and writing a story rather than being content providers? And shout out to the class of 1970, of which Ronnie is part.
Yeah, I think it's actually a really interesting question. I mean, we don't just not report the news. We definitely do still report the news, and there has been a shift of how we classify it as content. The thing is that we have to be competitive with other sources of media. It's not even just news media. It's entertainment, it's social media, it's just going off and having free time. Like, we're competitive with everything. And so the realism of this is, it's not that, the facts alone aren't going to capture someone's attention unless if they're just outrageously horrible. And so instead we have to try to figure out what's the best way to approach our audience. And I think that's where the content comes in, is what does our audience want from us? What do they need from us? And what's going to be the best receptacle for them to get this news? And so for us, when we talk about content, we talk about infographics and animations and video and audio, photos, making sure that everything is compelling. So I think content is a little bit more of making it compelling while still being factual. That's how I kind of would think content and just reporting the facts differs.
Which makes perfect sense. And my apologies, Ronnie, I appreciate your note. Mike, alums, Patty Miller has joined us. And of course, Patty Miller, who supports us with an incredible reporting opportunity for one of our a paid reporting position at the Lantern, which we're very grateful for. She's curious how alums know that the Lantern's available. And I know that you've made a lot of outreach efforts to our alums. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing to connect our alums with the school?
We're really trying to expand those efforts. Actually, Sandy Hermanoff, who we just mentioned, who works with Jay in her role as the founding chair of our alumni advancement board, really trying to brainstorm and also try to build relationships with the Alumni Association. Those of you here who are alumni who saw the alumni magazine, probably saw the large spread on the Lantern, which we thought was really they did a wonderful job of feature journalism, actually, covering the Lantern and the kind of work it's doing. So that was one of our efforts to really let people, because one of the best things in my mind about the increased emphasis on the online thelantern.com is that we have a lot of alumni who are deeply invested in this university, and there's no better place to know what's happening in this university than by reading the Lantern. And so the Lantern is as accessible to an alum in Tuscaloosa as to a student in Derby Hall. And I think it really does mean the community is much larger. I think the potential is vast as a result in terms of, as Jay said, it's also, part of learning to be a journalist is understanding it's a business too. And the business is serving readers with information that they're looking for. And so I think there's a growing interest in coverage that is of, good news is of interest to students and alums, but also thinking of, from the alum point of view, what also makes a good story, but they're an increasing part of our readership. And I think that's a very exciting development because that's very much part of the Ohio State community. We've also been working on developing a list of Lantern alums. We've tracked down many. If any of you are Lantern alums and we haven't tracked you down, please email us. We would love to add you to our list. We've created a website especially for alums. We do want to, we're talking about trying to develop a directory so Lantern alums who work so closely together can maybe get in touch with people they might have lost touch with that they spent many a long night getting meeting deadlines with. So it's an important direction for us. We've just created a new standing committee, the Alumni Engagement Committee. Professor Asay Apia is the chair of that committee and is very active with the Lantern and with alums to try to build those relationships. So if you're an alum, we'd love to hear from you.
Yes, we do.
And just in case if you wanted to actually read the Lantern and you're inspired after this, if you've never read us, our website is thelantern.com. You can always search Ohio State's newspaper. It also comes up that way.
Thanks. I was just going to ask that. Actually, Ronnie asked that question. We were going to get to that. I do, it's such a wonderful experience, right, to be part of the Lantern. And we have just so many amazing opportunities to, work with incredible students and incredible stories. But, Brian White has a great question here. And hi, Brian. Brian visited me in class today, which was super fun. Is it a challenge, I want you to answer this, Jack, to teach students today to be good, independent journalists when they're surrounded by and growing up with prominent news organizations that are inherently biased? So this rise of cable news, the idea of partisanship that we have now adopted within our news coverage, it challenges us on fronts that we may not even recognize, and it's kind of like the frog in the pot, right? You don't realize how immersed you are until you're on fire. So how do you work within that as an upcoming journalist?
I think one of the lovely things about being a journalism student is that you have people who are way more experienced than you, who kind of call you on your BS, where like if you're just kind of slightly going down the road path, where like you're not intentionally doing it, but you're kind of heading that way, they kind of grab you and pull you back in. But I can speak for the people that I work with on a daily basis and on an hourly basis. I mean, these are people who run out when they hear that there's SWAT teams and there's people with guns. These are people, when they hear that there's trouble, they run out because they know that that's important for us to understand and report back and let people know what's going on. And that's, trauma and horrible events have kind of earmarked, especially in the recent years, the last 10 years at the Lantern. And so I don't know. I think, yeah, we do live in this vacuum of like, how do you balance? And, you're seeing these other news organizations that get this attention because they are so sensationalized, but on a more like deeper level, we're all like people who just really want to understand. Like you don't go into journalism. Maybe you do, but the vast majority of people don't go into journalism just to be a talking head on, on cable television or, even those people who are on those, they're not journalists. A lot of times they're political analysts or, they're lawyers or they're people who don't have this foundation of just wanting to be a public service for their community. And so I don't know if that quite answers your question, but that's when you were saying that, Nicole, that's kind of what I was thinking about, that it's, you live in this vacuum of other people with this bad reporting, and how do you find the good reporting? And it's really just, you lay into what you were taught as a student.
Spencer, you want to jump on this one? Thank you, Jay.
I do run into this issue when we're talking with students, especially around political coverage and how we handle political coverage. And from time to time, it's a little bit surprising because if you grow up in a household that, you know, the news is coming at you from an advocacy point of view, then you think then we just are going to talk to Republicans about a Republican event, but we're not also going to call Democrats to try to bring in some balance to this story. And so I've run into some issues where it's like, well, no, but we also need to do this. Fortunately, it's really easy to explain the value of why we do that. And I think those issues, while they might be a little bit more common than you think, they're very easy to explain and deal with, and especially with students who are coming in and want to learn how to do this stuff. If you're going to do political coverage, there's a way to do it right. And that's what we talk about. But there is an advocacy point of view that I think does filter down to some people when they come in, and you know, we work with that just like we would work with anything.
Well, Jay, maybe you can take this question from, we have one from Linda Kramer, who was on the Lantern in the 60s and is a retired editor now. And then Timothy Powell, and they both ask a similar question, which is the diminishing marketplace of journalism. And, you know, how can we ensure that legitimate journalism is going to survive, considering the attacks against it and really people's diminished faith in truth and the reporting of truth?
Yeah, I'm worried that we can't. The business model that allowed newspapers particularly to do so well, it is broken and it's not coming back. I think we've got to live by our wits. I'm impressed with some of the not-for-profit ventures, things like the Texas Tribune, which has now been around for about a decade. And it decided in a state where I once worked, where there are great newspapers, that it was going to go against the trend. It relied on donations. You know, it may well be that we end up with a model akin to what is the public radio model of NPR. You've got a handful of situations where enlightened, benevolent investors have kept newspapers afloat, whether you like it or not. The Washington Post has benefited from Jeff Bezos. The New York Times company has benefited from the Sulzberger family over the years, but it is real tough in most other instances to find those kinds of supporters. So the answer to the question is, I don't know. I really worry about it. And I think one of the hard things with the journalists we have in the journalism school right now is, where do I go with this? How do I get a job? What does my future hold? And when you listen to what Jack just said about the willingness to charge into danger, you know, it breaks my heart if we haven't got outlets for people who want to do that work. But damned if I know, Nicole. I wish I did. I'd still be working.
I'm going to jump in. I just a thought about that. In a way, what the lesson of the last 10, 15 years has been is that gatekeepers matter, and they're important, and they're valuable. You know, the old story, you know, newspapers, journalists are gatekeepers of information. And there was a lot of hip hip hurraying early on the internet. Information is now free, it belongs to the people. We're free of the gatekeepers telling us what we need to hear. And that lasted about 3 or 4 years before what happened was the sewer gates opened, you know, and you just wound up drowning in sludge. So I think there is an awareness that gatekeeping matters. that it actually is a service that you want and that you need. And I suspect that there will be increasingly the notion that you're packaging and vetting information in the way the Wall Street Journal positions itself for people in the financial world, you know, the way Bloomberg does. In other words, I think I would not be surprised to see, you know, in addition to the few survivors because of their branding, like the Times and the Post, that will develop subscriber bases, startups that really focus on vetting information, on providing in-depth analysis. That the problem is it's going to be hard to build a mass audience, but it'll build very solid sort of high-end audiences that actually advertisers are going to want. These are people who are willing to pay for information to make decisions. Those are people who are usually worth getting to be able to reach. So I think there are niches that will develop and that people in Jack's demographic are going to discover as the startups evolve. But I think they're going to have to, because otherwise we're in deep.
Absolutely.
If you think about journalism and news reporting as a type of insurance for the public, that it costs very little. Like the monthly payment you have to make for journalism offsets the thousands and millions of dollars of wasteful government, of harmful government, of corporations taking advantage, of environmental policies that cost millions of dollars to clean up. It's $10 a month or less to subscribe to your local newspaper for an online version. It's a small little payment you have to make. That's the public insurance. You have health insurance and car insurance. Just insure yourself and insure the democracy and your children and the people that come way later with a $4 subscription.
Absolutely. Well, Mike and Spencer, we have quite a few alums on here who would like to, if there's a website or a way for them to get in touch, what's the best way for our alums to reconnect with the school?
Well, we have an alumni site, and I think the School of Communication has its own alumni site operation that, you know, we'd certainly be able to share with folks. You can reach out to us through our Gmail account, the Lantern. Well, actually, we have we're the Lantern at osu.edu, and that's a very easy way for us to reach out, connect you, for you to reach out and connect to us. And I'm trying to think of any other ways that we might be able to share that kind of information. I think those might be some of the easiest ways to do that. I know that we're looking at setting up a group on LinkedIn. I don't think that's been established yet. There are a couple of LinkedIn alumni groups already that are out there for Ohio State alums. We're trying to see if maybe we can join those things together. But I think right now the best way to do that for us to connect would be to reach out to us maybe through the Lantern's general email, and that's the Lantern at osu.edu. Edu. Yeah.
You can also find all that information if you just go to our website, thelantern.com. There is a contact us and an about page. You can find all that there.
Fabulous.
Thank you, Jack.
I am very excited to take a question from the amazing Amanda Etchison, who I had the pleasure of working with at the Lantern and teaching. And she mentions how impressed she's been as a former editor-in-chief on the work being done at the Lantern and the stories that have impacted beyond the boundaries of Ohio State. And she's asking, in what ways can we as readers, alumni, continue to support the Lantern and its journalists as the organization navigates changes to its publication methods and traditional sources of revenue? Are there areas of need that are especially wanting in light of the current situation, and how might our alums help us address those?
Go ahead.
There's a number of there's lots of possibilities. On the most basic level, please sign up for the email edition. Become a regular subscriber and user. It's free. It's wonderful. If you go to thelantern.com, we have a box for sign up for the email edition. We have, you know, for those who are interested in contributing, we have a box for donations. for even from a few dollars to naming the newsroom. We've got lots of opportunities. We have a mentorship program. You know, for those of you who are in the communication industry, whether it's journalism, also, you know, in strategic communication or public relations. So we have lots of students who are looking for mentorship opportunities. If those are things that you are interested in and are interested in doing, my email is slater.59@osu.edu. I'll forward you our email. Asay Apia is our alumni engagement chair and is organizing these mentorship activities. I'll forward your email to him, and he or somebody he designates will be in touch. Perhaps Spencer or perhaps Mary Sterenberg from the Public Relations Student Society will be in touch in terms of what might work out. Internship possibilities, if your organization has those. If you're retired and want to do some mentoring of a young professional in training, we'd love to have it. Just let me know and I'll pass it to the right person and you'll hear from them.
Great tips.
Again, it's slater.59@osu.edu.
Spencer, did you have anything more that you were thinking?
When you make a donation through that, there's a button on our website. It says support the Lantern. When you make that a donation, that money will go towards building an endowment for the Lantern. And we've already been fortunate to raise some money that we're getting some interest money out of that right now. That's supporting one of our editing positions. In fact, it's Jack's, right? And so the more donations that we get there, it builds up this fund, and then the more interest we get out of it. And that is, I think, a key way to move forward to make sure that the Lantern stays financially secure and independent. We do totally rely, well, almost totally rely now on advertising revenue. And while we're hopeful that after the pandemic ends, that money's going to go back up, it's always going to be subject to the ups and downs of the economy. And so the more that we can do to build a stable source of revenue, like through that endowment fund, the better off we're going to be. And then that keeps the Lantern independent and operating. So.
Hey,
Well,
Spencer or Nicole, somebody asked earlier, what sources of information do I rely on? I omitted the lantern.com. I got to tell you, it is fun all these years later to go back and to read and to reconnect. And I think, you know, what we want, hell, let's be honest about it. We want your money if that's good, but to get your money, I want your heart and soul first. And the best way to get that is for you to become a reader. And I promise you that if you do, you're going to rekindle some fires.
no question. Well, on behalf of our panelists, I am just thanking you, and I'm so grateful to you, gentlemen, for being here with us, for our audience who stuck with us and asked such amazing, wonderful questions. A special call out to our alums who have come back and joined us here and have continued to give back. And please know that the great legacy of the Lantern that has lasted for all these many years is continuing today with the utmost quality and commitment and pride, and it will continue moving forward in the future because you all set such a great standard for us to follow. So we thank you. We are privileged to have spent this hour with you, and please reach out to us. The Lantern was yours, remains yours. It is part of your Buckeye experience, and it's part of our Buckeye family, and we very much want you to still be part. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.